Hello and welcome to the Global Poker League and our new strategy segment where we ask our guest pro to take us through a key hand from the GPL. I'm joined by Jonathan Little of the Las Vegas Moneymakers. He's going to take us through a hand between Tom Marchese of the New York Rounders and Byron Kaverman of the Sao Paulo Metropolitans. Jonathan, take it away.
All right, so here we have a raise from Tom Marchese with 7-4 offsuit. We are playing pretty deep stack. It's certainly a fine spot to raise from the button with a pretty wide range. So there it is. We have a 3 big blind raise, a little bit larger than some players make, but it's perfectly fine whenever we are very deep stacked. And Byron with ace-9 offsuit. Some players re-raise, some players call. I think the majority of players are calling in the Global Poker League. So he does see a flop. Pretty good flop for Byron, and Tom has a very marginal made hand. This is a spot where a lot of players are checking behind with their bottom pair the majority of the time. Notice Byron's not going to lead or make any sort of bet into the pre-flop raiser. That's a strategy that almost no one is implementing in the Global Poker League because it's very, very hard to be balanced by leading, because whenever you lead with a hand like middle pair, well, that takes it out of your checking range. Now your checking range is much weaker. So pretty much everyone's just checking out of position the majority of the time. So he checks, and Tom is going to check behind with this bottom pair the vast majority of the time, because if he bets and gets called, he's usually pretty unhappy. So
5 of spades, it's the turn.
Looks like an innocuous card. This should not hit either player too often. Byron has to decide if he wants to value bet or if he wants to check, to just continue checking and hope that Tom decides to bluff. But right here, Tom could very easily have a marginal made hand that loses to a 9, like pocket 8s, or 7-4, or a hand like ace-queen that he may decide to call with. So this is a spot where Byron should make a somewhat standard bet. He does make a very small bet, though. He bets 1,000 into the 3,700 pot. That's quite small. And he's doing this so that Tom can conceivably call with a hand like ace-queen. Whenever your opponent bets very small, based on your pot odds, you have to stick around with a very, very wide range. So Tom does decide to call with this marginal made hand. He's probably not loving it, but he's getting an okay price. So on the river, Byron has to decide if he wants to value bet again. When Byron bets very small in the turn, like I said, it's going to keep Tom in with all sorts of junk. So that's going to allow Byron to make a river value bet with a hand that perhaps is not normally strong enough to value bet if he makes a larger bet size. So he does bet 2,300. Notice again, a very small bet on the river, and he's hoping here that Tom looks him up with, again, a hand like pocket 8s, maybe a 4, maybe a 5, maybe a 6, something like that. So I think this is a fine spot to value bet. It's worth mentioning here that Tom actually said before the game started that he thinks that Byron doesn't fold very often at all. So knowing that, I'm not sure if you ever want to turn this hand into a bluff versus someone who does not fold very often at all. But Tom correctly realizes here that he has relatively little showdown value with this bottom pair. If Byron's value betting anything, he loses. So calling is sort of out of the question, even though he does have a hand that many amateur players look at and think that they just have to call. That's the only option. But when you have a hand that's at the bottom of your range, which this is near the bottom of Tom's range, you should at least consider bluffing with it, even if you think your opponent's a calling station, because it's not like Byron is just going to be atrociously bad and call every time with any marginal pair. But to be fair, Byron may be a calling station because he thinks Tom bluffs too much. So you have this leveling game where Tom knows Byron's a calling station, but maybe he's a calling station because he knows that Tom loves to bluff.
Tom elects to raise, as we can see, to 9,800.
It's a sizable raise. Notice it is a decent chunk of his stack. This is a pretty sweet hand to turn into a bluff because notice he blocks 2 pair because it makes it harder for Byron to have a hand like 5-4. And he also blocks the straights because he has a 7 in his hand. So Byron with this middle pair now just has to decide, is Tom bluffing very often? Byron has a bluff catcher. He beats all the bluffs. I don't think Tom's ever turning a king into a bluff or pocket jacks into the bluff. And he's certainly not trying to get value from those hands. So if Byron likes to call, do you think he's going to call here? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly a tough spot, and this is what Tom is trying to do. Even if you know your opponent likes to call, you still have to try to bluff them some portion of the time. Otherwise, they can just start playing very well against you.
And yeah, I mean, if there's one thing we know about Byron, he's not going to make this decision too quickly.
Well, luckily we can speed up the replay through the magic of technology. And I don't know, what do you do in this spot? You call or do you fold?
Well, Byron eventually comes to the correct decision. Yeah, unfortunately for Tom there, it was like didn't have much showdown value and elected to turn his 4 into a raise. Was there anything? What were the hands Tom's sort of mainly representing there when he raises the river?
Well, he could very easily have pocket 6s. He could have a hand like 6-4. He could have 9-6. There are a very large number of hands he could actually have in this spot. He could sporadically have 8-7 that decides to check back on the flop with no equity, and then he turns a straight draw and decides to keel with it one time. There are a lot of very strong hands that Tom could have, but perhaps also he read into Byron's bet size. When Byron bet so small on the turn in the river, he perhaps made the read that he thought Byron had a marginal made hand. And if you think your opponent has a marginal made hand, it's a very ripe spot to attempt to bluff.
That's all for that hand, folks. Thank you to Jonathan Little. Join us again next time. Adios.
Connect with us on social media for league updates and download our app GPL TV to stay on top of everything GPL.